Hey y'all, welcome back. Before we get into today's cheating, lies, and public humiliation in high definition, do me a quick favor. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, every time somebody's bad decisions come back wearing Karma's favorite shoes, you'll have a front row seat. Let's get into it. Lydia stood at the head of a long candlelit table in a rented private room in uptown Charlotte, tapped her glass, and smiled while introducing the man she'd been sleeping with as the future of everything Ben helped start. Then she asked the server to remove Ben's place setting like he was an uninvited guest at his own life. Her cousins laughed. Her mother looked away and kept eating sea bass. The man replacing him reached for Lydia's hand without shame. Ben stood there still holding the cheap bourbon he'd brought, trying not to let his face crack in front of people who had once called him family. Here's how it happened. Ben Walker was a hard man to love and an easy man to depend on, which was part of the problem. He was from Durham, raised by a tired mother and a grandfather who believed apologies meant nothing without changed behavior. Ben grew into the kind of man who could fix your brakes, carry your couch, lend you rent money, and still forget your birthday. He had charm, broad shoulders, an uneven smile, and a history of making one selfish decision too many before finally doing the right thing. By 39, he owned a small logistics company in Charlotte and a house that looked nicer on Zillow than it felt inside. Lydia Walker, born Lydia Price, came from old black money in Atlanta that had learned to dress itself in church clothes and soft voices. Her father, Vernon Price, owned commercial real estate and distribution centers from Georgia to Maryland, but he carried wealth the way some men carry blood pressure, quietly and with danger. Lydia had gone to Spelman, loved linen dresses, kept excellent posture, and knew exactly how to make people feel small without ever raising her voice. When Ben met her at a friend's rooftop cookout in Washington, D.C., she made him laugh by calling his loud orange sneakers a cry for help from your feet. Their early years had real sweetness in them. Ben used to drive from Charlotte to Atlanta just to bring Lydia peach cobbler from a roadside place she loved outside Spartanburg, and she would pretend not to be impressed while eating half the pan with a spoon. Once, in New Orleans during a stormy weekend trip, they got stranded in a tiny hotel with flickering lights, bad jazz drifting through the walls, and no room service. They spent the night playing gin rummy on the floor, teasing each other, kissing between arguments over rules. Lydia said his shuffle looked dishonest. Ben said her trash talk sounded like an expensive threat. But Ben damaged the marriage before Lydia ever finished deciding what kind of wife she would be. 7 years in, when money was tight and his company was one bad quarter from folding, Ben had a brief affair with a woman he met through a shipping contract in Raleigh. It lasted 3 weeks and ruined years. He confessed before Lydia discovered it, which did not make it noble. It only made it impossible to deny. Lydia did not scream. She sat on the edge of their bed in Charlotte and asked him, in a voice flatter than paper, whether he had mistaken her for someone built to be humiliated and remain soft. Ben moved out for 4 months and aimed every ugly thing people said about him. Lydia's brothers called him weak. Her mother called him predictable. One of her cousins told him at a funeral reception in Atlanta that men like him always cry after the damage is done because tears are cheaper than discipline. Ben did not defend himself. He went to counseling, cut ties with a woman, gave Lydia access to every account, and did the unglamorous work of changing in private. He started showing up on time. He stopped lying in small ways. He learned that being sorry was not a personality. It was a debt. Lydia eventually let him come home, but forgiveness never fully entered the house. She allowed routine, not peace. They rebuilt the marriage the way people rebuild after a flood, keeping whatever looks dry, throwing away what smells ruined, pretending the structure is stronger because it survived. Ben accepted that. He cooked more. He made coffee exactly the way she liked it, dark and dangerous. He left notes in her glove compartment. On better nights, they laughed again. Lydia once nearly choked laughing when Ben tried to assemble a patio chair without instructions and somehow created what she called a segregation-era catapult. Still, tenderness had conditions now. Lydia could be affectionate on Friday and glacial by Sunday. Ben learned not to ask which version of his wife was walking through the kitchen in her silk robe. He carried the memory of what he had done like a brick in his pocket, always there, always deserved. Yet he believed time and consistency might slowly warm what he had broken. He did not know Lydia had stopped seeing the marriage as something to heal. In her mind, it had become an asset to manage until a better arrangement appeared. She was not waiting to forgive him. She was waiting to replace him. Vernon Price died on a humid August afternoon in Savannah after a stroke that hit fast and finished fast. At the funeral in Atlanta, Lydia cried beautifully and received guests like she was born with grief training. Ben stood beside her, held her elbow, passed tissues, and ignored the hard stares from relatives who still saw him as the cheating husband who had slipped into the family picture by talent and nerve. Vernon had always kept Ben at a measured distance. He respected hustle but distrusted appetites. Before his death, he had structured much of his estate in trusts and delayed distributions, including one enormous inheritance Lydia hinted about but never explained clearly. 4 months after Vernon's funeral, Lydia became secretive in ways that passed for ordinary mourning. She took longer calls behind closed doors. She flew alone to Baltimore, then Manhattan, then back to Atlanta, saying only that family attorneys are vampires with billing statements. Ben believed her because the sentence sounded like something only Lydia would say while pinning a scarf with jewelry that cost more than his first car. Meanwhile, his company, Walker Route Logistics, was bleeding from fuel costs, bad receivables, and a warehouse lease he should never have signed. To keep payroll moving, Ben borrowed against the house, then against a line of credit Lydia insisted she understood. Lydia did understand. She understood enough to see exactly where Ben was weakest. He trusted signatures from people he loved. He assumed shared pain meant shared loyalty. While he was in Memphis chasing a distribution contract that fell apart at the last minute, Lydia met with attorneys in Atlanta and a Polish consultant named Marcus Vale, a divorced operations executive from Houston with perfect teeth and no visible soul. Marcus was the kind of man who called everyone my friend and somehow made it sound like a billing category. Lydia hired him to advise on restructuring Ben's company. Ben thought Marcus was there to save the business. Marcus was there to study the carcass. Marcus moved through Ben's life like expensive mildew. He joined strategy lunches, praised Ben's instincts, and gently suggested decisions that increased Lydia's control over company accounts. He brought pastries no one asked for and laughed too hard at his own jokes. Once he came to the house in Charlotte wearing loafers with no socks during a cold snap, and Ben whispered to Lydia, "That man dresses like he lost a bet with weather." Lydia snorted into her coffee before catching herself. For a second, they looked like their old selves again. Ben held on to that second, not knowing she had already crossed the line with Marcus months earlier. The affair began in Houston during one of Lydia's supposed estate meetings. Marcus met her in the hotel lobby bar, where she was wearing grief like a custom coat and irritation like perfume. They bonded first over contempt, his for Ben's old betrayal, his for what he called men who build companies emotionally. Lydia told herself it was not really cheating because Ben had once done worse, and because revenge, when delayed long enough, starts dressing itself up as justice. She did not love Marcus. She loved how cold she felt around him. Cole made her feel safe. Cole did not beg, confess, or ask to be believed. When Lydia's inheritance finally cleared, it did so quietly on a Tuesday morning with a string of numbers that would have made most people dizzy. Just over $1.2 billion in trust assets, property interests, and liquid funds moved into structures her attorneys had prepared for years. She stayed at the confirmation in an office tower in Midtown Atlanta, then went out and bought coffee like the world had not shifted under her feet. She told no one except Marcus and her mother. Not her husband. Not even Ben, who was at that very moment arguing with a forklift vendor in Charlotte over an invoice he could barely afford. Wealth did not soften Lydia. It clarified her. Once she knew the money was real and irreversible, she no longer needed the marriage as cover, patience, or moral camouflage. She funded a legal strategy to protect her inheritance, separate assets, and exploit every weakness in Ben's personal finances. She helped Marcus form a new logistics venture in Texas that would absorb Ben's best clients once Walker Route collapsed. She instructed attorneys to move carefully, invisibly, and without mercy. Her mother approved. Her brothers approved. Nobody told her to breathe. Nobody said, "Lydia, maybe enough is enough. Money in that family had never been about comfort. It was always about control. Ben sensed distance but mistook it for old pain resurfacing. He tried harder. He planned a weekend in Charleston, booked a harbor hotel, and even packed the card game they used to play in New Orleans. Lydia canceled the night before, saying she had to deal with trust paperwork in Atlanta. Ben went alone and sat on the hotel balcony listening to bachelorette parties scream into the warm dark like joy was a legal requirement. He ate shrimp and grits in silence, then laughed despite himself when a waiter called him young blood, even though his knees had started making tiny betrayal noises every time he stood up. He came home with flowers Lydia barely noticed. The company fell apart in layers, not all at once. First came a missed payment from a major retail client in Tennessee. Then a vendor in South Carolina tightened terms. Then 2 drivers quit in the same week. Ben stopped paying himself. He sold his restored motorcycle. He took out a second loan using the house as collateral because he could not bear the thought of failing the men who depended on him. Lydia signed when needed and watched without warning him what the math already said. Every problem made Ben more frantic, more ashamed, more determined. He stayed up nights at the dining table, building recovery plans while his wife texted Marcus under the tablecloth. The cruelest part was how normal Lydia could still act. Some evenings she sat beside Ben while he worked and rubbed the back of his neck, asking whether he had eaten. Once she warmed up gumbo and teased him for looking like a stressed assistant principal at a bad charter school. Ben laughed until he almost cried from gratitude. That was Lydia's gift. She could offer tenderness with one hand while removing the floorboards with the other. Ben had not been a perfect husband. He had earned mistrust, but he had not earned theater. He had not earned a wife capable of comforting him while secretly financing the man waiting to step into his place. The invitation to the dinner party arrived by text from Lydia. Formal attire, private room, important people, be on time for once. Ben thought maybe, finally, she wanted to show unity in public before lenders and clients. He put on the charcoal suit Lydia once said made him look dangerous in a tax-paying way. He drove to the restaurant with a bottle of bourbon and a speech in his head about recommitting to the business and the marriage. Inside, the room glowed with money. Her family was there. Marcus was there. A few clients were there. Ben noticed there was no place card with his name, but still he smiled. Then Lydia stood and did it. She thanked everyone for supporting the next chapter, announced that Walker Root would be dissolved, and praised Marcus as the steady leadership needed for the future. Her cousin, already 2 cocktails deep, actually clapped first. Someone near the back muttered, "About time." Ben looked at Lydia, waiting for the joke, the correction, the human reflex that says, "Stop, this is too far." Instead, she said the house would also be sold because Ben's debts had made the current arrangement unsustainable. When he asked, too quietly, what she was doing, Lydia answered into the microphone, "Finishing something I should have finished years ago." Public humiliation has a physical taste. Ben would later remember it as metal and old pennies. Marcus rose and shook a few hands like he had been elected mayor of hell. Lydia did not cry. Her mother did not intervene. Ben's chest went hot, then numb. He set the bourbon down carefully because some stubborn part of him refused to let his hands shake in front of them. He left before the servers brought dessert. In the parking lot, he vomited beside a decorative hedge, then laughed once, bitter and hollow, because the restaurant valet asked if he was all right while clearly deciding he was not worth the upholstery risk. Everything after that moved fast. Lydia's attorneys had done their homework. The business, already unstable, tipped into insolvency once key accounts were redirected and credit tightened. Ben tried to fight, but every road led to paperwork he should have read more carefully and guarantees he should never have signed. The Charlotte house sold under pressure, its staged photos making it look like a place where nobody had ever cried in the laundry room. Even his son, Micah, who was 21 and still angry over Ben's old infidelity, kept his distance. "You made this mess years ago," Micah said over the phone. "Maybe it just took time to arrive." Ben landed in a plane rental outside Houston because it was cheap, anonymous, and close to the last viable lead he had. He had 1 truck, a folding table, 2 duffel bags, and a silence so heavy it seemed to hum in the walls. For a while he sank. He drank too much. He slept odd hours. He replayed the dinner, the laughter, the cold look on Lydia's face when she removed him from his own story. But even ruined men get tired of hearing themselves break. One morning he poured the liquor down the sink, shaved his face, and opened an old laptop containing records for a tiny freight route he had built years earlier under a separate LLC. The route was ugly, forgettable, and therefore valuable. It connected small manufacturers in East Texas to distributors in Louisiana and Mississippi. Nothing flashy, just steady shipments of parts, cleaning supplies, packaging materials, and industrial odds and ends bigger firms ignored. Because Ben had started it before Walker Route expanded, ownership was clean. Lydia's people had overlooked it, probably because they mistook modesty for insignificance. Ben rebuilt from that scrap. He called old contacts, swallowed pride, and took every practical job he could. He drove nights, dispatched mornings, invoiced afternoons. At a truck stop outside Beaumont, he ate bad pie and made 3 calls that eventually changed everything. Private success rarely looks cinematic while it's happening. It looks like spreadsheets at 4 a.m., knees aching on concrete, and learning not to flinch every time your phone lights up. Ben got sober for real. He hired carefully. He stopped trying to seem larger than he was. Within 2 years, the small route became Gulf Quiet Logistics, a lean brokerage moving specialized regional freight with the kind of reliability that earns referrals from people too busy to flatter you. Ben rented a modest office near Sugar Land, bought a simple home in Prince George's County, Maryland, closer to his mother, and kept his life mostly invisible. No posts, no bragging, no victory lap. Along the way, romance found him in a form gentle enough not to feel like punishment or rescue. Her name was Naomi Ellis, a widowed accountant from Baton Rouge who first met Ben while fixing a mess one of his subcontractors had made with payroll. Naomi had sharp eyes, patient hands, and a laugh that escaped in stages like it wanted to make sure the room deserved it. Their first funny moment came when Ben tried cooking for her and served chicken so dry Naomi took one bite, sipped water, and said, "Sir, who exactly were you punishing?" He laughed so hard he nearly forgave himself for having once believed suffering was all he deserved. Naomi did not romanticize Ben's pain, which made her easier to trust. When he told her about the affair years ago, the humiliation, the collapse, she listened without turning him into either monster or martyr. "You were wrong," she said. "Then you were wronged. Both can be true." It was the cleanest thing anyone had ever handed him. Their love grew in ordinary places. Farmers markets in Maryland, late flights to New Orleans for work, a rainy Sunday in Annapolis spent arguing over whether old-school soul sounded better on vinyl or in the kitchen from a phone speaker while gumbo simmered. Ben learned peace could be warm, not dramatic. Lydia's karma did not fall from the sky. It came through the same greed she had mistaken for intelligence. Marcus, polished and soulless, had been siphoning money through fake vendor contract and the Texas company they built together, padding invoices and routing funds into shell entities. When Lydia's attorneys dug into discrepancies, they found a web messy enough to trigger civil suits and tax scrutiny. Marcus did not apologize. He denied, delayed, and protected himself exactly as a man like that always does. Lydia's brothers, who had backed him loudly, turned on one another over missing distributions. Family meetings became warfight. The mansion in Buckhead had to be sold to plug holes no amount of pride could cover. Ben heard about all this from Micah. Oddly enough, time had roughened the boy into a man with more humility than certainty. He called from Atlanta and sounded almost shy. "Mom's in court every week," he said. Marcus played them all. There was no joy in Ben's voice when he answered, only stillness. Months later, Micah visited Ben in Maryland and found not a wreck, not a hero, just his father in a quiet home with good coffee, framed shipping maps, and Naomi humming in the kitchen. They sat on the back steps at dusk. Ben apologized again for the old betrayal. This time Micah believed he meant all of it. Ben never got his old life back, and that was the mercy of it. The old life had too much pride, too much pretending, too many cracks hidden under polished counters and date nights. What he got instead was smaller, truer, and entirely his. Lydia had wanted him erased, but he learned that surviving with integrity is its own kind of answer. He had been unfaithful once and paid dearly. He had also changed, and that mattered too. In the end, the lesson was simple and hard. Betrayal does not become wisdom just because you suffered first, and revenge built on money still rots the hands that hold it. If you made it to the end, you're officially family now. So hit like and subscribe, and come back for more love, betrayal, and the kind of karma that always shows up dressed nice.